To talk more about the Iran-Contra scandal is the man who actually broke the story back in 1984. Robert Perry won the Polk Award for his coverage of the scandal and joins us now to discuss. Robert, welcome. So first want to start off by asking you, how did you discover the Iran-Contra scandal?
Well, the work I was doing with the Associated Press was more focused on Oliver North. He had this dual portfolio. One side was for Central America and one side was for counterterrorism. I was focused more on his Central America side, and in covering that and dealing with where the money was coming from to fund the Contras, we stumbled upon his network, which was this essentially extra-legal operation being run out of the White House to get money and weapons to the Contras. Now, later on, it turns out that some of that money was being diverted from these arms sales to Iran.
Now, how would you describe, after breaking this story, how would you describe the public's response?
Well, the public was outraged, especially that President Reagan would deal with the Iranians, who had not that long ago been involved in their own hostage case in terms of taking American diplomats and other people working at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran hostage back in 1980. And that had been a major issue during the 1980 campaign as President Carter tried to win their release and was constantly frustrated, making the American government look weak and making him look weak. And that was part of why Reagan won so decisively in November of 1980. But the taste of all that was quite unpleasant still for the American people, and the idea that Reagan would be secretly funneling weapons to them was something that was hard to believe.
And I believe we do have a clip of President Ronald Reagan where he comes out after the story broke, where he comes out and addresses the public. Wanted to take a listen to that.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
So what do you make of President Reagan's response there? Kind of taking responsibility, but not really.
Well, I think there was a cover-up, and the cover-up was largely successful. Some aspects of the story were exposed, partly by journalists and partly by the work of Congress in bringing an investigation to bear for a while. But that all encountered very serious pushback from the White House and the Reagan administration, which led to the investigation never being seen through. There was an effort by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh to get to the bottom of these things. He was constantly delayed, and by the time he actually began to break through the cover-up in 1991, 1992, people were fairly bored with the scandal. People had forgotten about it. And then even as he was making progress in late 1992, President George H.W. Bush, who'd been defeated for re-election on Christmas Eve of 92, turns around and pardons a half dozen of the defendants, effectively killing the investigation. So the trials that might have explained much of this in 1993 never took place, and the cover-up ultimately worked.
Did you expect, I mean, when you first broke the story, that there would be ramifications for the big players, you know, like Reagan and, you know, and Poindexter? Did you expect that there would be some consequences?
Well, you have to remember that back in that time frame, 1980, it was not that far from Watergate. The Watergate scandal had led to Nixon's resignation in 1974. There had been a number of laws put in place by Congress to control the CIA and to limit what the president could do in terms of these kinds of secret activities. In a way, Iran-Contra was a pushback to that. Ronald Reagan and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, simply didn't want to go along with that. They wanted to carry out their own foreign policy. And so they found a way to do it, essentially circumventing Congress, circumventing the law. I suppose when you look at the fact that some of what they did would constitute felonies, i.e., the Arms Export Control Act, where people are supposed to report to Congress when they sell arms to a country, any country, but especially one on the terrorist list like Iran, the fact that that could be done and there would be effectively no consequence is somewhat surprising. But I think in retrospect, looking back at it, what you would see about Iran-Contra was it was that middle stage from the period of Watergate and the reforms to the more wide open approach that President George W. Bush operated with last decade. You could see Iran-Contra as a fork in the road. And ultimately, the United States took the path of allowing the president to do more and more in an unaccountable fashion.
And some going along with that, some people call Iran-Contra one of the greatest examples of the president overstepping boundaries and bypassing Congress. Do you believe that to be the case?
Yes, I think that was the case. The President Reagan effectively told Congress that he was not going to follow the law as if he did not wish to. When some of it was exposed anyway, he did a lot of dissembling and even lying. So did the people around him. They engaged in a very aggressive cover-up. They attacked the investigators quite aggressively, especially using some of their media assets. So you had basically the framework for the executive branch becoming unaccountable when it came to Congress trying to assert its constitutional role in setting these kinds of laws to constrain the president. So, yeah, I think what you see here was a case where the president did what he wanted to in defiance of the law and pretty much got away with it.
And you had mentioned earlier, you described it as a fork in the road. Do you think this kind of set a dangerous precedent for the way, business is conducted in Washington? And how would you say this scandal changed the course of history in the U.S.?
Well, I think basically what you saw here was the failure of the institutions of Washington to get control of these things. There had been an effort in the 70s, after Watergate, after the exposures of CIA abuses, to bring some constraints onto this process. And then you saw the Iran-Contra scandal, which was the first test case, really, of would Congress really hold the president to task and make sure that he couldn't go off in his own direction. And the press as well. The American press corps was changing here too, going from the more aggressive Watergate press corps to the less aggressive press corps we see today. And so I think in all those ways, the institutions of Washington failed to both enforce the law or see the law was enforced, but also in just explaining to the American people what had happened. There are still many sections of this scandal that we don't know the full story about, or even a chunk of the story. There's the real issue of when this actually started. The reports you had earlier described it as starting in 1985, which is the conventional wisdom. But there was evidence that we kept going back to, and as we trace the history of this, showing that the shipments actually began in 1981. And according to the Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, Nicholas Veliotis, when he investigated some of this, he found out that it went back to 1980 and the Reagan campaign, when some people in the Reagan campaign were making contacts with the Iranians off books. So we never have gotten to the bottom of this, whether or not this was actually a much bigger scandal that involved essentially trying to fix an American election in 1980. We don't really know all that happened in that early phase. We do have a glimpse of what happened in that 85, 86 timeframe, which we have a pretty good history on now. But so much of this remains still something outside the historical picture that the American people have been denied. We don't really know who did what and why and even how.
And, and despite the magnitude of this scandal and the implications of it, it seems today most people don't even know what it is or that it ever even happened. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you find that shocking? And why don't people know more about this?
Well, there was a desire after this period to make Ronald Reagan into more of an icon. One of the greatest presidents ever is the way some people put it. It really doesn't match the historical record, but there was a tremendous effort to name buildings after Ronald Reagan. They named National Airport in Washington after Ronald Reagan. He was turned into this kind of iconic figure, this hero. And that was very important for the Republicans. In effect, they wanted their version of John Kennedy, and they used Ronald Reagan to sort of build their entire brand, if you will. So I think that was a factor that people came away, and the conventional wisdom was that Ronald Reagan was a nice guy trying to do the right thing. The evidence may not match that, but that's the sort of the hangover of this period. That's what people think. That's the conventional wisdom. So I think given that, there's been a desire to sort of shove aside some of the unpleasant history about Ronald Reagan and just look at the good side.
All right, very interesting. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was Robert Perry, investigative journalist for consortiumnews.com.